Now I got to do one more thing.
Okay, there we are. Okay, well, thanks. This is the introduction from last week's ethnobotany presentation, and John heard about it and asked me if I would give, a similar talk, which I think part of we did a little bit when we talked about psychedelics, but this is a little broader, and my intent is to really have you realize how much you already know about plants and the way they contribute to our lives. And some of this will be California focused, but some of it will be a little broader. Um, anyway, so ethnobotany is the study of where man and plants overlap. And it's really a story of coevolution, because I think you'll see that, we think we've harnessed plants, but arguably plants have harnessed us in many ways. And are responsible for, obviously some of the way we live, depending on where we are, but even the way we've evolved. I put here plants support all animals directly or indirectly. These are the broad categories, but food, shelter, medicine, fiber, dyes, materials for tools, musical instruments, jewelry, and even clean air. One word, life. So go ahead to the next slide, John. Next slide. That was just thanking the people who helped there. So, here's these broad categories that we're going to talk about. And, I want you to think for a minute, and then I want to ask you, which of these categories are most obvious to you? And do you have a specific example? Maybe it's from the Miwok villages, that some of you work at. But start with food and sustenance. What plants did you eat this morning? You're muted, Harold.
I had lots of grains for breakfast.
What kind of grains did you have?
Well, granola, rolled oats, and probably wheat. And,
Okay.
oats and wheat for the most
Right.
part. And
Yeah,
nuts.
grains are a
And
huge
nuts.
component, right? Grasses, grains, rice. Okay. Somebody else. What else did somebody have last night for dinner?
Well, this is Carol. For breakfast actually, and I learned this from Barb, I had quinoa and oats, but lots of vegetables in it. Onions, I love onions, and carrots and spinach and kale.
Oh, sounds good.
And yeah, she does a savory kind of thing. It was really good.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So quinoa, another grain.
Green.
And I don't know, I'm going to say just at the outset, I don't know the origins of all of these grains. I do know a little bit more and read a little bit about what the Miwoks actually used here in California. But obviously it depended on where you were.
Thing.
Because if you were in, Europe before the New World was discovered, you didn't have some things like potatoes, right? Or tomatoes. So big, and there's been a lot of mixing over the course of the last 300 to 400 years. And of course, now we get many of these things from South America or from, anywhere around the world, they're flown in. But so it's important to think about what's in your neighborhood, what's local, what's in season, and yeah, lots of foods. Housing, I gave you a hint here about, and we'll go through each of these a little more details, but teepees to log cabins, to straw bale housing, to wood. Right? If you think about our homes come from trees for the most part. And housing, and I could add in, and warmth, right? For many, many years, trees were and are still in many places the source of fuel. And if it's not trees, it's often coal, which is million-year-old trees, right? But plants are the source of the conversion of the sun into fuel. Solar is now, but anything that's in plants, anything that's in wood is energy that was entrapped by plants, and then either as a wood cut down, 50 years later, started 50 years ago and now we're cutting it down, or millions of years ago and then got buried and compressed and turned into coal and gas. Some people say it's all the dinosaur, ferns, and that gives us our natural gas and our coal and our oil. And when it comes to climate change, some people say that every time we pull something out of the ground, we're putting it into either our air or our water. And one of the things we need to really move away from is pulling more carbon-based sources out of the ground. But transportation in the primitive level, canoes and rafts. I think John and I have been going back and forth, and there may be a future presentation about the possibility that man reached South America before he reached North America via rafts 23 to 25,000 years ago. There's some new evidence. But it's certainly known that boats were used for transportation, all around through Indonesia. When we did the talk in the botanical gardens in San Francisco, the Andy, who's for 40 years was the curator of the gardens, walked us around and showed us some trees that were used by Central American and South American peoples because they were very good for canoe making. And they would cut down one tree and make a canoe that could hold 30 or 40 people. So they used transportation, those canoes, rafts, spices, smells, beauty, color, form, and music, medicinal herbs, and then we'll spend a little bit of time about psychedelics, because at least with the horticultural group, that was something I knew more about than they did, which was always nice. Okay, next slide, John. So this was dinner a few weeks ago with a friend, and I just, on the left we have corn tortillas, corn or flour tortillas with beans in them. On the right we've got rice and beans and avocados and onions. Then going to the right of that we have a salad. The cheese obviously came from cattle that ate plants. And then to the right of that was a tomato, onion, on top of the tacos. They happen to be fish tacos. But as you eat, the realization that everything comes from plants. One of the other big things in climate change is to eat less meat, because it requires the sun growing the plants, then the plants getting eaten by an animal, and there's about a 90% loss in efficiency in that cycle. So by eating meat, you're eating very concentrated energy. And one of the mantras for climate change was meatless Mondays. I'm imagining this group is not a steak and eggs in the morning and hamburger every lunch and a steak for dinner, but much of America is. Meat at every meal is a staple. And meat's very expensive in terms of energy production.
And the other thing with animals is you use a lot more water per
Yes.
capita.
Yes, water, and right, exactly. Expensive in many ways. You have to water the plants, then you have to feed the water to the animals to keep them alive. Then it's about a tenfold. When you eat 100 calories of a plant, you would only be eating about 10 calories of an animal in equivalent, because it takes about 10 times as much energy for the production of meat. Okay, next slide. So this is a little more traditional for the Miwoks, but some of the things that they, acorns from the oaks, Quercus, was really the preferred form. There's many oaks, I think 120 total type of Quercus in California alone. The Central Valley had the black oak, and the Quercus agrifolia is more along the coast, I believe. But acorns from those were the preferred meal. I know John has mentioned Grinding Stone State Park up in northeast California. There are many grinding stones. A camp I worked at up in the Sierra for 20 plus years had a grinding stone right at the center of camp. And that was at about the 4,000 foot level, which is right about where the oaks are, but it was a nice in between, because During the winter, it got a little snow, but not too much. And in the summer, it didn't get too much heat. So it's thought that the band of where a lot of the preferred living was maybe from 4,000 down. You go much above 4,000, there's a lot less fuel and food. They might have gone up there to hunt, but their villages were often between 2,000 and 4,000 feet up. That's inland. Along the coast, obviously, it's quite different. It's not quite as hot, and we know that. John, correct me on the numbers, but I think just around the San Francisco Bay, there were dozens, if not 100 different Elonian Miwok villages. That may have to take us all up into Martinez, but Emeryville, Shell Mounds is one huge example. Marin had a number. John, do you have a number about how many actual villages there were?
Well, the Shell Mounds is 400.
Shell Mounds is just by itself is 400
Yeah.
villages. Okay, fine. Then I stand corrected. But it was, and of course, those villages were probably what, 100 to 200 people?
Yeah, maybe 150.
Okay, yeah, 150. So that's, times 400, that's 60,000 people living around the bay. That's
Oh.
quite a few.
I think
I mean, they probably hunted a little farther and wider. Yes, Bruce.
Yeah, no, the question was that has been some cataloging around Mount Diablo of the various grinding stones and mortars that were around, and I think they've come up. They've got essentially thousands. And I don't know if you've seen the new map of the Mount Diablo range, and heading all the way down. It's the gosh, who did that? Was the East Bay Hill people, I think, that did that, have done an extensive mapping of the area all the way down to the Pinnacles State Park, and so there were villages. There's at least 6 tribes that were in the Mount Diablo area here.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, it's the climate, as we know, the climate is pretty good year round.
Yep.
And the food sources were plentiful. Not only salmon and fish from the ocean, but you had a lot of grazing animals that came out of the Central Valley. So if you were in Diablo, you could go east to the valley and pick off bison or elk or deer, and you could go west and you could pick off fish, and they would trade extensively and dry the food, obviously, and then the acorns would be a vegetable source. Buckeye was only used for really bad backup, and in difficult areas, it's quite toxic. Actually, they use the buckeye for fish poison, but you really have to leach it a lot. Other big sources, somebody mentioned onions, the alum family, garlic is included in that. And, one of I would say the lessons is vegetarian food, as with cooking vegetarian food, takes a lot more energy. You take down a deer, you got 200 pounds of meat, you can eat 30 the first couple days, and then you can dry the other 150, and that lasts you a long time. You catch a salmon and you dry it out by a fire, and you've got 10, 12, 15 pounds of salmon, which is a lot of fuel, and it can store. Acorns was more the women's work and the children's work, gathering them. But you can go to Berkeley Bowl and buy a pound of acorn meal. I've actually had crackers or cookies made of it. It's tasty. It's like $30 a pound, and that reflects the difficulty in the gathering. Pine nuts, similar sort of thing. It takes a lot of pinyon family pines to make those nuts. There are some that have much larger seeds than others, but if you think about a pine cone and opening it and peeling out every little one at a time seed, it takes a lot of doing that to get a pound of pine nuts. So they were more of a supplement. And again, season, of course, matters. The Vitaceae family, the grapes, were used both fresh, but a lot of it was the ability to store food, because there were times of plenty, spring into summer, and then there were times of less, fall and of course winter. They might have still been out hunting animals, but there's not much growing in those times, so they would have had to store it. Next slide. Housing. This is an example of Miwok bark homes. There were also tule reed homes used along the bay here. Next slide. Just an example of a canoe. Here they're using a wood for the structure and then likely a skin of an animal stretched over that. So it's a hybrid plant and animal form of transportation. But as I mentioned, there are some trees that can be hollowed or burned out and then scraped out to make into a full tree canoe. And also tule reeds could be lashed together, and that is some of the original transportation across the Pacific with some of the large tule boats.
And down south with the Chumash, their big advance in technology was the tomo, where they hollowed out a very large trunk. And these tomos, they had 12 men could fit in a tomo and row and go way out beyond the breakers. It expanded their whole fishing culture. And that is one reason the Chumash were probably the most advanced civilization that Portola and Sarah came in contact with.
No, thank you, John. Yeah, I as I was giving this talk, I was with my daughter going cross country, and we saw Tom Hanks in that movie about the plane crash where he's stranded on the island for 4 years, and he has to learn how to hunt and feed and feed himself. And it's interesting to think about, what's around you that you could eat if Safeway wasn't there or Albertsons. Okay, going on from transportation. Next slide, John. Bow and arrow. That main form of hunting, and of course, was often coupled, or almost always coupled, with obsidian heads, and obsidian comes from the volcanic areas of California, in particular the east side. There's a large area of obsidian up there. So there was trading done between the west of the Sierra and the east of the Sierra. And yeah, go ahead, next slide. Basketry and tools. People probably know, but the baskets on the left, there's a lovely display of them in Yosemite Valley if you get up there at their Miwok village. I don't know how many people have been to that village. It's right by the visitor center. But the last time I was there, they had a Miwok descendant woman who is still making the baskets. She's a national park employee, and she's paid to basically be a living museum. But these baskets could hold water. Once the reeds swelled, they would hold water. They could be put on a fire to cook the acorn gruel, or they would put, often more likely they would put a hot stone in them to cook. And these are obviously more modern day tools, but there have been some more tools, both of stone originally, but then wood and obsidian. And John knows this, but there are some, and Homer, you probably know this, there are some surgical tools that are not considered as sharp as obsidian. Obsidian is broken glass. And if anybody's ever broke glass and picked up shards of it, you know how sharp those little pieces can be. So obsidian tools, not really from plants, but from man. Okay, next.
And the theory is, why didn't the New World have metallurgy? In particular, the Central and North American natives, and one explanation is they didn't need it.
Because they had obsidian.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, it's true. And Europe, I guess, didn't. But Europe has Mount Etna and Vesuvius, and there must have been volcanic. I don't know. Were there obsidian tools in the old world, John?
I don't know.
Well, we'll find out in October when we're there, won't we?
Yes, we will.
We're going,
Well,
John and Iko and I and my wife Christine, we're going to Sicily and then up the Amalfi Coast. We'll visit Naples, but we'll be stopping in Pompeii, which I think everybody knows was a city frozen in time in 79 AD when Vesuvius covered it in poisonous gas and a 6 to 10 foot layer of ash. So there's some. I was recently at the Surgical Museum, John, in Chicago. The American Academy of Surgery has a museum there, and they have a facsimile of the speculums that were used in Pompeii
wow.
for rectal exams and for vaginal exams that are not that dissimilar from the 1800s tools developed in the West. It's impressive how much we had to reclaim and was hidden from us. Okay, teas, spices, scents, beauties, and color. So, Laminaceae, mint family. Does anybody know some of the, obviously mint itself, but how many other Laminaceae family are there, and can you name a couple? I bet you can. Nope, she's muted. She's shaking her head no. So many smelly things are mint family. One of the fun things about mint family is if you want to know if something is mint, they have square stems. So I did this in-person talk and I had them, but if you roll the stem of a Laminaceae family, it goes clunk 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 because they're square. So next time you look at your rosemary or your oregano or many common spices, they are in fact Laminaceae family. Rose family. People may not realize, but apples, many other stone fruits, pears are all rose family, as well as obviously rose and rose hips, which could be used again for teas and spices, sources of vitamin C. And we'll talk a little bit more about medicines and other uses going forward. But there's many other families. I don't know. Does anybody have another example of a tea or a spice? I mean, Iko, you in the kitchen, you can probably look up there on the spice rack and give us, rooibos comes from this, or I mean, most teas are plants. They're not all Camellia sinensis, which is the classic kind of green to black tea. But there are many herbal teas that are herbs.
How about licorice?
Licorice, there you go, another class. Sure. What anybody have tea with breakfast this morning? Come on, Harold.
I did.
And what did you have, Carol?
Well, that was Shigeko, but I had green tea. So
yeah,
that
I
was,
had green tea too.
yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay,
what's an
making
herb
green
tea?
So
But so what's is chamomile?
chamomile's an herbal. It's an herbal tea. So tea traditionally refers to the Camellia sinensis grouping. So there's a specific, green tea. Black teas are sort of a processed green tea. But herbal teas are a much broader category of basically any herb that is seeped and made into a drinkable tonic or drinkable solution. Tonic's a little different.
Do the Miwok drink teas like that?
They definitely use manzanita. Manzanita berry, the little apple, not an apple for a rose family, but manzanita was definitely used and makes quite a tasty tea. If you've never had manzanita tea.
How about bay leaves?
Well, I don't know if you'd make a tea from bay. What do you think about for bay, John?
Well, I just know that when you take the walk on Mount Diablo, there's just tons and tons of bay.
Yeah. Well, and bay is clearly uses bay laurel as a spice to cook with, less of a tea. People did use it medicinally. I was actually shown, if you want to try a fun trick, next time you're out, peel a leaf, roll it nice and tight, and stick it into your nostril. And Homer, you'll appreciate this. It has some bronchodilating components. And if you've never smelled a bay leaf up close or gotten a kind of a blast of it, it definitely opens the nasal passages.
Oh,
So
yeah. It'll clear your
bay leaf would
sinuses in a
do-
heartbeat.
I'm sorry, Harold.
It'll clear your sinuses in a heartbeat.
Oh yeah. I thought you said it would stimulate your heartbeat, which many bronchodilators do as they open the lungs and kind of stimulate the heart. But yeah, they will. It's quite effective, and I've never seen somebody put them in both their nostrils. But if you do that for even a minute, you'll realize the potency of it. So yeah, bay leaf, John. Thank you. Any other suggestions, docs? People like that?
Lavender.
Yeah, lavenders.
Oh, that's great.
Again, do you think of that as a tea, Homer, or do you think of that more as on the medicinal spectrum?
I was thinking maybe beauty. It's like a perfume. It's it has good
Perfume,
scent.
yeah, exactly, scents. So roses, lavenders, many scents were equated with love and beauty.
There was something called Mormon tea, some bush. Do you know what that is?
Yes, I've heard of that, but I'm not sure. Somebody can Google that while I'm occupied here. But you're right, there is a Mormon tea.
Oh, yeah, and we encountered that on the Navajo reservation, and it's got ephedrine in it, which is a stimulant.
Right, I think it's ephedra is the actual chemical, but ephedrine is the derivative, and ephedrine is related to the bronchodilators.
Yeah.
Directly, and I think Homer, was that ever used in asthma? Ephedra itself, or has it always been a derivative?
No, ephedra was used. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's I mean it hasn't been used for what 50 years or something, so we're dating ourselves to remember that.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah,
I'm looking up Australian bush tea.
Australian bush tea. That's ephedra in a number of Chinese. I don't know. My daughter's a Chinese medicine expert, and she could correct me in lots of ways, but they have a whole different way of looking at disease. And sometimes it's, by too much qi or not enough qi, or too much moisture or not enough moisture, too much heat, too much cool. And medicines are thought of in that way. And ephedra is one that will, if you don't have enough movement and you don't have enough energy, ephedra is a good one.
I think there was some, maybe apocryphal, but there was a story of ephedrine being used to persuade a English physiologist who claimed that none of the Chinese herbs had any pharmacologic action. And then someone showed ephedra to cause a dramatic increase in blood pressure in a rabbit or something. So that I think ephedra as a treatment came from China. Not certain of this, but
I know it has deep roots in China. And while we're on that, when we look at Western medicine, what percent of Western medicines do you think have their origins in plants? Think about that for yourself just for a second.
A lot.
Okay, what's a lot?
I think it's over 50%.
Okay, over 50. That's one definition. Anybody want to go higher?
I'll go 80.
80.
I'd go at least 99.
99, Harold. Okay. The truth is, I don't know the actual answer, but it is certainly probably over 80. Now the Western Pharmacopoeia doesn't want to tell you that. There are some medicines from toad skin secretions and from snake venom. So there are some animal derived. There's also, when we talk about psychedelics in particular, we'll talk about some of the mold or fungus derived medicines, but many of our modern pharmacopoeia, penicillin, of course, it also is a mold, so not technically in the Plantaceae species. So, but I would guess somewhere between 50 and 90 is a reasonable guess, particularly if you think about scents and spices and poultices as medicine.
Yeah, and salicylates.
Salicylates from willow bark.
Yeah.
Salicylacea is the family of willow, and yes, willow bark can be chewed. It's one of the things we've been convinced of in our Western medical world is that we can't trust the purity, and therefore we have to go to the pharmaceutical industry. Well, we'll talk a little bit about that deeper in psychedelic realm. And there's some truth to that. You know, when you're chewing willow bark, you know, how much willow bark do you need to chew to get the equivalent of 325 milligrams of, you know, aspirin, acetylsalicylic acid. But there's also this thought that in isolating compounds, you may remove some of the essences of the chemical themselves. I know more about this, and we'll talk about this a bit more when we get into talking about cannabis, because in that field, the research is just exploding, and it's very clear that what, you know, we might have learned in medical school about delta 9 THC, which is a particular chemical structure of THC, delta 9. So at the 9th position, there's a change. There's also delta 8, delta 7, delta 6, delta 5. And it turns out there's multiple endocannabinoid receptors. So what has been a huge area of repressed research is just exploding in terms of anti-inflammatories. So getting a distillated or a chemically synthesized delta 9 THC is quite different than, say, getting an extract out of a plant. And we'll talk about that. So, you know, about halfway down this, you know, what does separate a spice or a scent from a medicine? So, Homer, you mentioned lavender. Is that a scent, or does that have some medicinal qualities?
I don't know.
Well, don't they say that lavender, like they put lavender in soaps and things because it's supposed to be very calming?
Okay, so yeah, it's certainly a calming agent. Many of the herbs are, right? I think I saw Homer sort of nod. So is something that calms the beast a scent or a medicine?
I think it's a medicine if you smell it.
It might be a medicine if they bottle and charge you for it.
And if they charge you a lot, it's a really good medicine.
Right. The more they charge, there's some yeah, well, yeah, that there's some bias in that, but yes, you're totally right. Well, and then you could even say what separates a scent from a medicine from a toxin. So if you do that with the bay leaf and you leave it in there for more than about 30 seconds, you can get a bit of a headache. And obviously, as we talk about many other substances, you can take a little bit of digitalis, which comes from the foxglove plant, right? And we prescribe it as digoxin, but too much will kill you. The same becomes true when we talk about psychedelics. There's some interesting stories there. So, you know, what oftentimes separates a medicine from a poison is the dose. And things that are very therapeutic in small amounts can be quite toxic or even fatal in large amounts. Okay, anybody else have anything else or questions about this slide? Okay, let's go on, John, from here. So, you know, in the same vein of what separates out a scent from a medicine, what separates out musical from spiritual? And, you know, what's known, again, I'm leaning into the psychedelic realm, but what's known is that it's hard to separate those two. And if you were to go to a traditional ayahuasca circle in Peru or Brazil, drumming is a huge piece of the ceremony. The rhythmic drumming, which may actually put your heartbeat into synchronicity. And drums here made from large hollowed out trees, and flutes here made from hollowed out pieces of wood. Were clearly a part, you know, shakers, all kinds of rattles. Again, if you just think about say a Native American dance circle, music is a huge component of that.
Oh,
And,
everything is kind of derived all from plants, and ultimately medicines. When is it? You know, so.
Are you muted, Bruce? No, you're not muted. You were talking to your wife or somebody.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me.
No, that's okay. I thought you were doing a recap. That's fine. No, just there you go. Now you're muted. But that was good. It's you've been following. I feel validated as a teacher. Thank you. Or
Excuse me. Well,
I'll-
I had some technical problems and finally got back up, and I guess I forgot to put the mutes and things on. Okay.
all good. Good to have you back. And of course, even the strings on this are from plant fibers. And the paints would have been derived from different pigments. And so, okay, next slide, John. So here's a little more. We've talked about some of this, but tinctures and potions. So taking a plant and either soaking it in water or alcohol or some sort of a different something to distill it out. Used for many things. And if you just think about, whether it's, sore throat lozenges that you get from Switzerland, whether it's breathing, we mentioned that already with, ephedra and bay leaf, skin poultices. John, can you think of any poultices that would be applied that were derived from plants?
Oh yeah. What is it? From sheep,
Urea?
a product that actually we use as an ointment for irritated skin. It'll come to me. But
Okay, that's from sheep.
yeah, so
Lanolin?
Okay,
it'll
many
come.
examples, that can be thought of, and next time you're, even the pharmaceutical derived aloe is one I think most people could think about from a skin point of view, that can be very good for burns, and then things taken to calm the gut. You could think of, say, ginger as something that calms the GI tract, or urinary tract. People often talk about cranberry juice, things that change. Again, the Chinese medicine would be things that change essentially the pH, but change the energy of the body. We mentioned
there's a product called throat coat, a tea, and if you look, it's licorice.
Okay, licorice. There you go. You mentioned licorice before. Thank you, John. And licorice or have a licorice or a mint after dinner. The other, of course, is coca, chocolate, right? We'll talk about Coca-Cola as we move into the next section, but mood, we mentioned lavender, but Artemisia vulgaris, otherwise known as mugwort, grows all over the East Bay Hills. And it is very good for dreams. We have it in our yard, and we bring little sachets to people. There are many things that may help with dreams, but that is one of the better ones. Pain. So Arnica montana is fairly well known for strains and strains, but poppies, not the California poppy, but the opium poppy, of course, is the source of all the opiates, from which we've derived, oxycodone, morphine, dilaudid, blah, blah, blah. So whether you count all of those as coming from the poppy or not is debatable, but the original origin of opiates is from the Papaver family, which is poppy family. And then mind-altering substances, and I said what comes to mind, and I gave you a hint right there. But did you include coffee? Definitely known to be a mind-stimulating drug. And I don't know about you guys, but I had my coffee this morning. And if you're drinking tea, if you're drinking green or black tea, you're drinking theobromine, which is a methylxanthine, a very similar chemical, mild bronchodilator, many other things, but it increases stimulation. One, I don't know if I mentioned, but what about nicotine? Where did nicotine come from? It's the Nicotinia family, tobacco plants, and tobacco, nicotine is a direct neural stimulant on the preganglionic and postganglionic, so the autonomic and sympathetic parasympathetic systems, very strong, incredibly addictive, harnessed in the 40s and 50s by the tobacco companies, for which they then paid somewhat dearly, much like the narcotic industry has been paying quite dearly. You know, I don't know, 1% of their profits or something. But nicotine cigarettes make you measurably smarter for about 5 minutes. So if you're on standardized tests and you smoke a cigarette, you think of these movies, you know, Oppenheimer. Guy was a chain smoker, right? But it does sharpen the brain a bit. Obviously, you spend the next 25 minutes thinking about your addiction and where your next cigarette is, and it has all kinds of health problems. You know, I think they say 500 million people who are alive today will die of tobacco-related deaths. Right? And Homer, you've seen that in lung cancer and congestive heart failure and COPD and all the horrors that come along with it. Next slide, John.
I think there have been some studies that show that people are workers are more productive on nicotine.
Yeah.
It's not just for 5 minutes, it might be for most of the work shift, if not all of it. Of course, the downside, it all depends on how you take it. And if you wind up absentee because of COPD, that's a minus. But in terms of just acuity, it does work. The other comment I want to make is about the Artemisia family. There's been such a terrible problem with resistance of malaria to, you know, chloroquine, and the quinones, right? That's another plant, I think. But the Chinese have a medicine that's based on Artemisia that they cultivate, and they had it available, and at least for a while. It was by African countries who have a close relationship to China, ever deepening. They were importing Artemisia for resistant malaria. Yeah,
right. I'm not talking too much about antibiotics, but obviously there are many. You know, penicillin, all those came from molds. So yeah, lots of medicinal uses there. Thank you, John.
Ask a question?
Yes, please, Echo.
Obviously chemical companies can titrate this stuff and know how concentrated it is or whatever. But the thing is do they prefer to use chemicals because it's just faster to gather the materials and produce a pill or whatever for you, or why?
Yeah, well, you know, it depends on the substance, but you know, acetylsalicylic acid or aspirin is totally synthetic because they can make it in, you know, millions of pounds at a time, and going to strip all of the willow trees would be problematic. So there's somewhat of a supply and demand. I don't know what percent of pharmacological grade medicines are synthetic at this point, but my guess is a lot of them.
So, you know, the synthetic is becoming a very plastic term. Once you get the plant's DNA, the world's your oyster, the way things are now. And I think one of the examples is transplanting a plant DNA into algae, right? And then mass producing whatever chemical you want to do. So the boundary between synthetic and natural is porous.
Right. And what John's referring to is they can take out the section of the DNA that actually codes for the particular product, put that into an algae, and then the algae as a byproduct makes the stuff, and you just harvest it out of the water and distill it. So very good point, John. Thank you. Okay, next slide. And because I want to get us through this a little bit. So here's coca, Erythroxylum novograndense, the leaves and the berries. And we all know coca. many people may know that Coca-Cola contained cocaine and cola until 1909, when it was removed. So, I think isn't it Freud who was a cocaine addict?
Yeah.
Right. So cocaine was widely used, and in snuffs, the anatomic snuff box that many of us learned in med school, the little spot here at the base of our thumb, was for that. But coca is a psychoactive alkaloid, and cocaine is still used in the emergency room. It's a wonderful anesthetic for getting a foreign body out of the nose. I don't know if they use it with bronchoscopy. Homer, probably not, but it's wonderful for ENT. I think it's called green solution, or it used to be. Next slide.
Also, it's coca tea is available in every hotel lobby in Cusco.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's quite good for high altitude sickness. And you chew on the leaves or you make the tea, and it's not illegal. There are all kinds of debates about what is legal, what is not legal. We get into talking about growing mushrooms. You can actually ship around spores of the psychoactive mushrooms, and you can ship around agar plates or agar chunks that people can inject them in. You just can't send the actual mushroom fruiting body. So you can send people the materials to make, and if they do it on their own, that's fine. In fact, I've heard this, and this would be a good group to ring it up, but I have heard that if a physician synthesizes a chemical, they can dispense it to their patients. That there's some clause in there that if you make a chemical, you can give it out. And I don't know how that it works under the FDA, but and if you'd be prosecuted for giving out psilocybin if you grew it, but interesting to think about.
Well, with John, I may remember that when we had our freshman lecture from a very famous doctor, Dr. Lee, and he told us that when you mix the medication before administering the patient, put a little bit on your pinky and taste it, and then add something to it to show the patient that you really knew just what it was supposed to taste like before you gave it to them.
Yeah.
Those were the days, yeah.
Those were the days. Yeah, well, I in full disclosure, my birth name is Pepper, but my grandfather's name was Pfefferman, which means spice man, or the pharmacist, one who dispensed the spices, because indeed that's what was done 100 years ago. And it sounds like even, I don't know, what are we talking, over 50, 60 years ago when you were, yeah. So it's, not that long ago that things were a little different. We now think they're all in pills and dispensed by a pharmacy, but we're not that far removed. Next slide.
Can I make just a little tangent that it has to do with Californian history and precisely where we are on the beaches of San Diego. And Homer, because you brought up lectures we got as freshmen, I am going to tell you as a preview for maybe it'll be next week. You will see some of the murals that were in Cole Hall, and one of them is of the ship's doctor that on the Portola expedition, the sacred expedition. And this poor doctor had so many problems, which I've alluded to. Typhus and scurvy, and but also traumatic injuries. And one of the murals shows this doctor, Dr. Pratt, who was with Sarah on the beach in San Diego. It's another one of these wonderful examples that we talk about of the unexpected connections between stories of the past and what we've encountered on our day-to-day lives.
Of course, we call them doctors in retrospect, but they were probably more likely, or just as likely, barbers or removers of testicles for cattle. Because
no. Dr. Pratt was a graduate of the University of Salamanca. which, believe it or not, the Enlightenment was running in parallel with the Inquisition.
Oh, okay. Well, and where's Salamanca? Is that Italy?
Spain.
Oh, Spain. Okay. I've been reading a
One
little
of
bit
the-
about the first medical
doesn't it-
schools in
Doesn't it
Salerno.
claim to be the oldest university in the world? Salamanca?
I think that's in Italy.
Yeah, Italy, Salerno, and
Oh, wait a minute.
Bologna.
But you mean from the Moorish period? Cordoba.
Cordoba. It depends on how you count it, because of course Socrates and in Greece there were medical schools that were far advanced of the Dark Ages. So I'm not sure. Western medicine maybe is more what we're talking about.
Yeah, good.
Okay, let's go forward here. Okay, so I mentioned THC, cannabis sativa here, and cannabis indica. They're two major strains. I asked this of the group of 30 or so very accomplished, experienced horticulturists. What family does cannabis belong to? And John, you can't answer this because I think I've told you this. What is the other member of this family that you all know that is used to make a very popular brew that the British drink a lot of? Come on, Harold, you got to bite this, or Homer, somebody's got to take this. No?
The rum?
No?
Tea.
No? Beer. Hops is the only other member of the Cannabinaceae family besides marijuana.
Huh.
Which is, and I don't, after I gave this talk, I was like, I don't know if they've investigated beer to see if it actually has, THC components, but you would think as a member of the family, there might be some psychoactive. So maybe those really hoppy IPAs actually have a little more to them than just the alcohol.
Huh.
But cannabis broadly has two major branches, cannabis sativa and cannabis indica, isolated in the 1850s. They're quite different in terms of psychoactive. And in fact, if you haven't gone into a pot dispensary, I encourage everybody to go to one. It's stunning. It's like going to the highest end liquor store you've ever seen. And instead of 12 rums, there's 35 sativas and tinctures and jellies and salves and sleep aids. The science, the legalization of it basically created a huge business, which they're now taxing. But we're just beginning to learn about this. And I alluded to the endocannabinoid receptors, of which there are many, at least 9 classes in the body, very involved in anti-inflammatory. And I think if you other physicians haven't seen it, I saw a number of my patients, including my father, who were on opiates for pain. My dad had sciatica. And once we got him a little THC vape pen, he was able to get off the oxycodone entirely.
So who's making these things? The cannabis.
They're some of them are pharmaceutical grade. They're now tested and licensed. There are production companies all over California, Colorado. It's gone from being a under the radar plant harvest to a in the greenhouse multi-billion-dollar business. But there's some benefits, and don't knock it till you tried it, but a little bit of a THC salve for swelling, or a little bit of THC for sciatica or back pain or anxiety or insomnia can be, very powerful medicine. I wouldn't claim the anti-cancer, anti-diabetic, and neuroprotective events that are noted here in ScienceDirect.com, but stay tuned because the research is ongoing. Again, the pharmaceutical industry doesn't have as much interest because it's legally available as a plant, so they can't charge for a lot of it. Next,
Well, how many cannabis preparations have met the FDA's criteria for efficacy and safety?
I don't know, Homer, but they're not I mean, Drabanol or Marinol did. And that was for, glaucoma and for anti-nausea for chemo. I don't know the new answer to that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And then I'm going to go a little quicker here, but some of this is repeat, but psychedelics in the distant past. It's thought, it's the ArcheoChemistry knows that in Turkey about 8,000 years ago, there are chemical remains of ergots. Ergot is the fungus that grows on many of the grains. I have a picture of it in a little bit. It is purple. It was responsible for many problems in over times. It was used as a postpartum drug to stop bleeding, but it also caused St. Vincent's fire. It can cause a very strong vasoconstriction and psychosis and death, in fact, in some of the Roman troops. Talk about this. Cannabis 5,500 years ago in the Hindu Kush. Moses in the burning bush. The Jewish translation of the apple is not apple. It's loosely defined as a fruit, and there are many Jewish scholars who feel that this may have actually been a mushroom, which could make a lot more sense from Moses seeing the burning bush and coming down from the mountain with visions. For about 2,000 years in Eleusis, which is 8 miles outside of Athens, there was the Eleusinian Mysteries. Called the Mysteries because we don't know exactly what was going on there, but the priestesses of Demeter and Persephone would hold ceremonies where men, once in their lifetime, would enter into a pseudo underground experience for about a week. And it's not known what was done, but it's thought it might be preparation for death. There is a saying from Eleusis that is over the arch, which says, if you die now, then you won't really die when you die. The idea being that if you can understand your connection to the world through psychedelics, then you'll lose some of your fear of death. And I was just on a conference call this morning talking about that. Psychedelics.
Can I just relate an experience Psycho and I had there?
Sure.
Here in the East Bay, there was a Wiccan, right, group, witches, loosely translated, and they sponsored the celebration of the Eleusinian Mystery on Baker Beach in San Francisco, on the ramparts of the old ruins, embattlements from World War II.
Oh.
They created that into a nice stage to celebrate the myth of Persephone and Demeter's or Ceres from Cereal, right? The goddess of the plant, which we're talking about today, and her daughter Persephone was kidnapped by the Lord of the Underground, Hades, and a deal was negotiated where Persephone would be released for half of the year, which made Ceres very happy. And that's when the earth was productive and created plants, right? Which was what we're talking about today. And we celebrated all that. And what made it even more interesting for me personally, and I will vouch for it, is Persephone was naked by the end, and they took a dip in the bay. And this is at night. They went down to the bay water and dove in. Persephone did. I can't remember if the mother did. I don't think so. Aiko, do you remember? Anyway, that we've experienced the Eleusis Mystery on Baker Beach in Homer's San Francisco.
Homer, mine too, John. I grew up 2 blocks from Baker's Beach.
Oh, that's right. You did.
Yeah, 25th and Lake. And it's also the site of the first Burning Man, Baker's Beach.
Is that right?
89, 90, and 91 was Baker's Beach. Yeah.
I didn't realize that. Okay.
Oh. Well, we'll get to the witches on the next slide, but many of the archaeochemistry reflects wines, beers, and brews, of which some of the molds were introduced as well. And it's thought that the Persephone, Demeter priestesses had figured out the balance between the poison and the psychedelic. We'll talk a little bit more about witches specifically. I found it interesting when I gave this talk. It was in 1826 or something that the German beer making requirements finally took out that you could not have mushrooms in the beer. Up to that point, mushrooms had been used as part of beer making, which is, I just think, interesting, again, to think about the origins. And then, belladonna and the eyes. But there is a book, several books, about the origins of Christianity. And there's fairly good evidence that in the tombs of Rome, in around the turn of zero, that rites of passage often involve psychedelics. And so the origins of Christianity themselves may in fact be within psychedelics.
Wow.
Next slide. So here's the ergot, and this is the causative fungus is Claviceps purpura, so named for its purple color. Purple is a Roman color. I mentioned the St. Vincent's fire. The Roman troops often died of it if it was not harvested right. And yeah, next slide. I got a couple more here. So here's psychedelics more recently. So John mentioned the witches, and as an American, I grew up with Salem, but in fact, 2 million women and some men were put to death in Europe around the same period of time. People don't realize how widespread, but this is often thought to be sort of that there was a feminist uprising. At this point, men and the Medici family had moved medicine into being more of a male dominated, but women had, and still for many years after that, dominated birthing and maybe dying. But the witches and their broomsticks did use belladonna, henbane, and some mushrooms. I mentioned the bane of beer. And in fact, the broomsticks were either rectal or vaginal suppositories for inserting medicines, which you can imagine being quite threatening to some men. But I'll leave that to your imagination. Lamarck here in 1785, cannabis sativa versus indica. More recently, 1900s, mescaline was extracted from the peyote cactus, Lophophona williamsii by Hefter. I mentioned Coca-Cola, the opium trades. And then, many of you, and I certainly caught the tail ends of the 1950s, the famous Bicycle Day in Switzerland, when LSD was discovered. It was being investigated as an ergot for postpartum bleeding when surreptitiously a small amount was ingested and led to a famous bicycle ride, which basically led to the discovery of the serotonin system. They didn't understand the serotonin system prior to that time. And psilocybin from psilocin was key in understanding the roots that chemistry again for us, the doctors, but tryptophan is metabolized to 5-hydroxytryptophan, which is serotonin, and psilocin, or the active ingredient psilocybin, is a hydroxylated serotonin antagonist.
What happened on the bicycle ride?
What?
What's Bicycle Day? What happened?
What's Bicycle Day? Who is the man who discovered LSD?
Well, Timothy Leary.
No.
He popularized it.
Timothy Leary popularized it in the Merry Pranksters in the 1960s. Switzerland, Basel, Switzerland.
And bicycle? What's it?
He tried a very small amount and had an interesting experience, and then a couple days later, on I believe April 19th, 1943, this gentleman took 250 micrograms and had a full-blown psychedelic trip, which is ever commemorated in the psychedelic realm for Bicycle Day.
Oh, okay.
Did you Google it? John,
Okay.
did you Google who it was?
No, I didn't.
Oh, well, somebody will. I'll leave you hanging. So LSD, Time Magazine, Gordon Watson, 1956. Gordon and his wife went to visit Maria Sabina outside of Oaxaca, Mexico, to taste the flesh of the gods, and popularized psilocybin, which was then made quite popular by a number of Hollywood actors. LSD was dispensed by Sandoz. I believe 25,000 doses were given mostly psychiatrists to understand the potential uses. There were about 1,000 studies, published studies in the 60s and early 70s before it was shut down about the use of psychedelics for addiction, for mental health. Sasha Shulgren, whose home is in Lafayette. Sasha and his wife Anne are both dead now, but there's a home that is somewhat of a shrine because he developed some of the synthetic chemicals. He worked for a pharmaceutical company, went off on his own, developed many compounds for which he's greatly loved, including MDMA, which is ecstasy. But that's not necessarily a plant-derived substance, so we won't go into that.
So there's a Stanford connection here. Ken Kesey,
Yeah, that's right.
who graduated from Stanford, he was a wrestler, right? And he wanted to compete in the Olympics, but there was still a couple of years to go, and he was in Palo Alto with nothing to do. And the VA hospital asked for volunteers for a secret program. Some people say it was the CIA. And he signed up and became a subject in a LSD program to see if it would be useful in warfare, mainly to paralyze your enemy, I suppose.
Yeah, that was the CIA. There's a whole operation around that.
Yeah, and so the electric cool acid test came from that, and the bus and the whole thing, and Ken Kesey. Thank you, the VA hospital in Palo Alto.
Yeah, Palo Alto is quite a source. And John, I'll give you Abby Hoffman was the chemist in Basel, Switzerland.
Oh, okay.
And I'm just Googling it because I wanted to check the date. April 19th, 1943.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, a chemist for Sandoz in Basel, Switzerland, ingested a minute amount, 250 micrograms. So less than a milligram, quarter of a milligram of a compound derived from an ergot fungus. He felt so disoriented that he rode his bicycle home, where he experienced all the heavenly and hellish effects of LSD.
Wow.
Okay, let's go to, we got a couple more slides, and I'm just aware of the time. Peyote takes forever to grow. It grows in an area of the United States, Texas and Oklahoma. It is a plant, a Cactaceae family, used medicinally by many of the Native American church and tribes. It's quite a longer acting psychedelic and a threatened species. Next slide. San Pedro grows all over the East Bay. People have it in their front yard. It's quite psychoactive, although you have to cut it and stir it and brew it for 2 days. And I have friends who've tried to make it. It's a little tricky, but if you look for this plant, you'll see it in many gardens, certainly in Berkeley, I believe in farther East Bay. Next slide. So here's psychedelics in our lifetime. And again, just kind of, I think I'm close to closing this out, but post 60s, the fear and loathing of the Nixonian White House shut it down, and many of you, I kind of escaped because my father was a faculty at San Francisco State and smoking pot in the 60s, but it was forced underground. I think we all remember, Your Brain on Drugs, and the fallacious stories of a person who got high and jumped out of the window. That was sensationalized here a few months ago by the pilot who did mushrooms and they made it sound like that's why he tried to crash the plane. They didn't mention the fact that he'd been distraught, despondent, depressed, and not slept for 48 hours. But a lot of forced underground. But there are 15 million doses of MDMA a month taken in this country right now. 36 states have cannabis legal. Oregon and Colorado have now legalized, sanctioned, and set up divisions of their health plan to oversee psilocybin therapy being done. So we are seeing a reemergence. MDMA was used very successfully for trauma and for couples. It's shown tremendous promise in the vets with PTSD. And for pain, suffering, death, anxiety, and existential meaning, psilocybin can be profound. If you haven't seen How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, it's a 4-part series. If you don't want to read the book, it's quite well done. Nolan Williams in Stanford is doing a lot of work with ibogaine, which is a whole nother league of psychedelic. And then a friend of ours, Bob Jesse, has been involved and was involved with Roland Griffins in this concept of betterment of well people. So not only for, treating people with a DSM criteria of major depression or suicide, but for expanding your brain. There's some thought, if you watch the movie Fantastic Fungi, that mushrooms may have been involved in the evolution of early primate. They took this and it was like, whoa! Now all of a sudden that bone was seen as a tool. So, is there another slide, John? Oh, yeah, ayahuasca, which is a combination of Banopteris cappii and another chacruna plant, is ayahuasca, or Aya is a Central American, often very long ceremony that induces serious psychedelic and visions, not to be tried on your own. It is, I haven't done that. This is one I haven't done yet, but it is legal under the Native American Church and is seen as a sacrament by many countries around the world. And then one more slide, maybe? Oh yeah, ibogaine. So iboga, used as rite of passage in West Central Gabon, Africa. I've talked to two, it has when used in the right setting for narcotic addiction, it has something like a 60 to 70% abstinence rate at a year. It is profoundly powerful for the right people. I've talked to two patients who did iboga surgery therapy after they'd been on methadone for 2 years, gone cold turkey 4 times, tried everything they could to get off of their prescription oxycodone. It is described as a film reel of every difficult or challenging experience you had in your life, shown before you in Technicolor, with a panel of elders behind pointing at all the options where you could have done better. That's a bit of a summary, but if you get that idea, it's if you get a chance to talk to somebody who's done iboga, it's I was stunned by the 2 testimonials I've taken, and it's now being Kentucky passed a $42 million bill to use its component of the narcotic prescription lawsuits against the pharmaceutical companies to investigate iboga. It's not legal in this country. It is legal in Mexico, where Nolan Williams is studying vets who go there to get off of narcotics. It can, for the physicians in you, it can cause a torsade de pointes in about 1 in 1,000. So they're using it with magnesium to calm the heart. That's an irregular heart rhythm that can be fatal. So not to be toyed with. And I think, is that the last one, John? Oh, just about psychedelic psychotherapy. And I think I talked about this earlier, but my wife is a ketamine therapist. Ketamine is legal. It has been for 50 years. It's on the top 10 drugs for the WHO. World Health Organization. It's an incredibly powerful drug. It's incredibly cheap. And if used in concert with psychotherapy, can be very powerful. There were 1,600 new ketamine clinics in the United States last year. It can be problematic. It's often the FDA approved it for use in a quiet room without any psychotherapy. My wife and I feel that, and many people feel that that is a total travesty and a total sellout to the pharmaceutical company, which made a spray that's $800. The lozenges you can buy from a compounding pharmacy are about $5 each. And we both feel, many of us feel it should be done in coordination with setting up intention and deep integration to understand what's presented to you. It can bring up trauma, but it is a dissociative anesthetic that allows people to step away from the emotional components of triggering experiences and process them in new and interesting ways. It is not a plant. So I'm just wrapping up with that. I believe that's it.
And it's being used for depression.
Its FDA approval is for treatment-resistant depression only. It is being used off-label, as we know many drugs are, for, yes, depression, for existential angst. It's being investigated in end-of-life angst. It's being used for addiction. It's a, I sometimes recur, and excuse my French, but psychedelics can be a bit of a bitch slap. And again, if you've never done psychedelics, it's like trying to explain a rainbow in a snowstorm to a blind person who's sitting inside. The sensations, the sounds, the psychological transformative energy that can go on is quite profound. And in the right hands can be very useful. Why is society so scared? What are the roots of LSD and the anti-war? I mean, Timothy Leary was famous for, telling the young people to get out of the war. And many people feel that's why Nixon was so against us. He was a war, war machine's good for business. Is capitalism threatened? Is religion questioned? Is pharmaceutical involved in the pharmaceutical industrial complex? I think that is the last slide, I hope. Oh, well, do I have concerns? Yeah. It's you don't go doing mushrooms on your own. Don't do any of these substances. Even if you're trying cannabis, try it with your wife or your partner or a friend, or call me up. I'll come with you. Come hang out. But 80,000 Americans died of narcotics last year. 80,000. One guy did psilocybin 2 days before, was sleep deprived and depressed, and he made front page news about how psilocybin almost killed 80 people. That is capitalist hype, in my humble opinion. Vets are committing suicide 7 to 10 a day, many from addiction, depression, PTSD. Dying is an industry, the medical industrial, we make money off it. Most of these psychedelics are a one-time, maybe twice. There's not a good model for making money on pharmaceuticals. So who's concerned? Who makes the money? And do we trust Big Pharma? Do we trust the FDA? Do we trust the medical board? I think there's some wisdom from the underground that is clearly emerging, whether it's from the witches, whether it's from the Eleusinian Mysteries and the Wiccans, or whether it's from 36 states legalizing cannabis and understanding it has some roles in health. I would encourage you to keep your mind open. And I'm pretty sure that is the end.
Okay.
Thank you.
End of life. Yeah, that's just 7 minutes or so. Questions? Went a little over.
Thank you, David. That was excellent. I appreciate it.
Fascinating.
Yes, and yeah, so you're okay if we post this on my YouTube channel, right?
Oh, please do. I want the link for my website.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't say anything that's I'm not doing any of this. I'm not. I'll come sit with you if you do cannabis. But yes, Bruce.
Yeah, a question that my son is a musician, and he just recently went down to that Joshua Tree Festival.
Oh yeah.
was just last weekend, and
Yeah.
he went with a group of Guinean musicians, and basically this is the first time that he was kind of into a situation there where all the people around him and the people of the festival goers were basically it was his thing was he hadn't been to a Burning Man event before, which I have, but he just was saying everybody seemed to be having some kind of drugs that they were using, but the musicians they didn't understand it as to what was really going, because they all had all of their drums and just exactly what that from Africa, and that was their background. So it was very interesting to see that I think one of your early slides said something about how does music fit in with the drums and the flutes and things, and these guys, they could care less about didn't need drugs. They were just basically working so hard on their music.
On their drumming, yeah. Is that Coachella? Is that that's what you're thinking about?
I thought it was Joshua Tree.
Yeah, that's down by Coachella. Coachella's down there. But yeah, you're entirely right. And I don't know if everybody goes to Burning Man does inordinate amounts of drugs, but it's an altered state already. You're staying up during the night, and so your point is well taken. That and I don't know if any of you read Carlos Castaneda when you were younger, but he was one of the gateways. But his later in his books, he says, these are a doorway to let you see perceptively different. You don't need to live in that perception, and indeed, ketamine can be addictive, but nobody's doing psilocybin on a weekly basis. Nobody's doing acid. It is a journey, and it takes. If you're just doing it, you're totally missing the point. And to your point there, you may not even need substance at all. And I'm sure your son didn't inhale.
No, just for place he doesn't need to. Yeah, no, that's true. There's kind of like.
I'm teasing, Bruce. It's
yeah, no, that's
Maybe I better stop recording.
Really?
Yeah,
it's a social security number.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, yeah.